A king once stood before his people and declared something no human being has the right to say. With absolute confidence, surrounded by wealth, armies, and power beyond imagination, he looked at the people who feared him and said, "I am your most exalted Lord." This was not just arrogance. This was rebellion against the very Lord who created him. This was Fir awn, a man whose name would become a symbol of tyranny until the end of time. But what he did not realize in that moment was that his downfall had already been written, and it would come in a way no king, no empire, and no power on earth could ever stop. Thank you for watching Islamic Insight channel. I would love to know, which country are you watching from? And if your heart is drawn to stories rooted in truth and faith, make sure you subscribe and stay connected. Said Firawn ruled over Egypt with unmatched authority. His kingdom was vast, his control absolute, and his command unquestioned. People obeyed him not out of respect, but out of fear. He manipulated their minds, controlled their beliefs, and shaped a society where truth was buried beneath propaganda and intimidation. The Qur'an describes how he elevated himself in the land and divided its people into groups, strengthening his grip by keeping them weak and divided. This was not accidental. It was calculated. Pharaoh understood that a united people could challenge him, but a broken people would remain under his control. So he created fear, spread injustice, and ensured that no one could rise against him. Among those he oppressed the most were Bani Isra'il, the children of Israel. They were not just another group in his kingdom. They were the target of his cruelty. He enslaved them, forced them into hard labor, and stripped them of dignity. Their lives were filled with suffering from sunrise to sunset. They built his cities, served his needs, and lived under constant fear. But what made his dhulm even more horrifying was his policy toward their children. Every newborn boy was marked for death. Soldiers were ordered to kill them without mercy, while the women were left alive, forced to carry the grief of loss and the burden of oppression. The Qur'an captures this dhulm in a way that shakes the heart, describing how he slaughtered their sons and kept their women alive, spreading corruption throughout the land. Imagine the cries of mothers who held their newborn sons knowing they would soon be taken away. Imagine the silence that followed when those cries were gone. But this was not just oppression. This was systematic cruelty designed to erase a people, to break their spirit so completely that they would never think of freedom again. Pharaoh believed that by doing this, he could secure his throne forever. But dhulm never brings security. It only brings a delayed consequence. And then came the fear that began to haunt him. It was said that a child from Bani Isra'il would one day grow up and destroy his kingdom. Whether it came through a dream, a prediction, or the whispers of those around him, Pharaoh believed it, and that belief terrified him. For all his power, for all his armies, for all his claims of being a god, he was afraid of a child. This fear pushed him deeper into dhulm, so he intensified the killing, making sure no boy would survive. He thought he was outsmarting destiny, so that by eliminating every possibility, he could prevent what was coming. But this is where the reality of divine decree becomes clear. No matter how powerful someone is, they cannot escape what Allah has written. Pharaoh was trying to stop a future that had already been decided. Every order he gave, every dhulm he committed, every life he took was only bringing him closer to the very outcome he feared. Because the child he was trying to kill would not only survive, but would be raised in a place Pharaoh thought was the safest for himself, his own palace. There is something deeply powerful in this moment. A king who claimed to control everything could not even control his own fate. A ruler who believed he was divine could not see what was right in front of him. This is the beginning of a story that is not just about history, but about a truth that repeats itself across time. Dhulm may rise high, arrogance may seem unstoppable, and power may look absolute, but when it stands against the will of Allah, it is already on the path to collapse. In the middle of that fear, in a time when every newborn boy was a target, a child was born whose story would shake the foundations of tyranny forever. His mother held him close, knowing the world outside her arms was filled with danger. Every sound, every knock, every movement carried the weight of terror. This was not just the fear of losing a child. This was the fear of losing him in the most brutal way imaginable. Yet in that moment of overwhelming uncertainty, something extraordinary happened. Allah placed a command directly into her heart. It was not a suggestion, not a thought born from desperation, but a divine inspiration filled with both instruction and promise. She was told to nurse her child, and when she feared for him, to place him into the river. Not to hide him in the house, not to run away, but to let him go into the current. And then came the promise that defies human logic, a promise that only someone with true trust in Allah could hold on to. Do not fear, do not grieve, for he will be returned to you, and he will be among the messengers. Imagine what that required from her. This was not a simple act of faith. This was surrender at the highest level. A mother placing her helpless infant into the unknown, not knowing what the river would carry him toward, but trusting completely in the one who controls the river itself. The water flowed, carrying the small basket gently yet decisively, moving through a land controlled by the very man who wanted that child dead. There was no accident in this journey. Every moment, every turn, every wave was under divine command. And then, in a scene that captures the depth of Allah's plan, the basket arrived not in a distant village or hidden place, but at the doorstep of Firawn's own palace. It was discovered by the household of Firawn, the very people who were part of the system that ordered the killing of children like him. Yet Allah placed something in their hearts that changed everything. Pharaoh's wife, Asiya, saw the child and felt an immediate connection, a mercy that overcame the brutality surrounding her. She spoke with a sincerity that cut through the darkness of the palace, saying that this child would be a comfort for her and for Fir awn, urging that he not be killed. Now in a palace built on arrogance and oppression, her words carried a softness that stood in contrast to everything Fir awn represented. And just like that, the child who was meant to be hunted became protected, not just by chance, but by divine design. Fir awn, who had ordered the death of countless children, allowed this one to live. He did not recognize him. He did not see the threat. He did not realize that the very decree he feared had already entered his home. This is the power of Allah's plan. The one who claimed control over life and death could not even control what was happening under his own roof. The child he sought to destroy was now being raised with the resources of the very empire that oppressed his people. Surrounded by luxury, educated in the ways of the palace, and protected by the status of the household, Musa grew up in a place where no one could have imagined he belonged. Yet even in that environment, Allah preserved something deeper within him. He was not shaped by the arrogance of Firawn, nor did he adopt the dhulm that surrounded him. Instead, he grew with a sense of awareness, a sensitivity to injustice, and a connection to truth that would reveal itself as he matured. And one of the most powerful signs of Allah's promise began to unfold early in his life. The infant who had been placed in the river refused to be nursed by any woman in the palace. No matter who they brought, he would not accept. This created concern, confusion, and urgency. And then, through a series of events guided by Allah, his own mother was brought forward as a solution, without them knowing who she truly was. In this way, Allah fulfilled his promise. The child was returned to his mother, not in secrecy or fear, but openly, safely, and under the protection of the very system that once threatened his life. Time passed, and Musa grew into a strong young man, living between two worlds. He was raised among the people of power, yet his roots were connected to the oppressed. This duality shaped his perspective. He saw what others ignored. He felt what others dismissed, and then came a moment that would change the course of his life forever. One day, he entered the city at a time when people were less active, and he came across a conflict. A man from his own people, from Bani Isra'il, was being overpowered by an Egyptian. The scene was not unusual in that society, but what made it different was that Musa was there to witness it. The oppressed man called out for help, and Musa responded. Now, in that moment, it was not calculated. It was not planned. It was a reaction driven by a sense of justice. Musa struck the Egyptian, intending to stop the Vum, but the result was far more serious than he expected. The man fell, and his life was taken. Silence followed. The weight of what had just happened settled heavily on Musa's heart. This was not a victory. This was not something to celebrate. He immediately recognized the gravity of his action and turned to Allah with sincerity and regret, admitting that he had wronged himself and asking for forgiveness. And Allah, in His infinite mercy, forgave him. But forgiveness did not erase the consequences of the situation. News of the incident began to spread. The next day, Musa encountered the same man again, involved in another conflict. It became clear that the situation was escalating, or as others were beginning to notice. The Egyptian who witnessed Musa's involvement questioned him, and the truth was no longer hidden. What had been a private moment of regret was now becoming a public matter. The risk was no longer just emotional or spiritual. It was physical. His life was now in danger. Then came a warning, urgent and sincere, from a man who rushed to him from the far end of the city. He told Musa that the leaders were plotting against him, that they were discussing how to deal with him, and that he needed to leave immediately. This was not a suggestion. This was a matter of survival. Musa did not hesitate. He left the city, not with a plan, not with provisions, but with reliance on Allah. He stepped into the unknown once again, much like he had as an infant in the river, but this time consciously, not choosing to trust in the one who had guided him from the very beginning. As he walked away from everything familiar, he made a simple but powerful supplication, asking Allah to save him from the wrongdoing people. There was no guarantee of what lay ahead, no clear destination, no certainty except one, that Allah's plan was still unfolding. And just as before, every step he took was leading him toward a future far greater than he could see in that moment. He left behind everything he had ever known without looking back. No palace, no protection, no familiar faces. Just a man walking alone into uncertainty, guided only by trust in Allah. The desert stretched endlessly before him, harsh and unforgiving, with no clear path and no promise of ease. Hunger, exhaustion, and isolation became his companions. So yet there was something stronger within him than fear. There was reliance. There was a quiet certainty that the one who had protected him as an infant in the river would not abandon him now as a grown man walking through the wilderness. Every step he took was heavy yet purposeful, as though he was being led even when he did not know where he was going. Eventually, his journey brought him to the land of Midian. It was not a grand city like Egypt, not a place of power or luxury, but it was a place where life moved with a different rhythm. Here, people gathered around wells, tending to their animals, living simple lives far removed from the arrogance of kings and the dhulm of empires. Musa arrived tired, worn, and in need. Yet he did not arrive empty of character. Even in his state, his sense of responsibility and justice remained alive. As he approached the well, he noticed a scene that stirred something within him. A group of men were watering their flocks, pushing forward with strength and urgency, while at a distance stood two women holding back their animals, waiting. This was not something he could ignore. Despite his exhaustion, despite being a stranger in an unfamiliar land, he stepped forward and asked them what was preventing them from watering their flock. Their answer was simple, yet it revealed much about their situation. They explained that they could not compete with the men and had to wait until the crowd cleared, and that their father was old and unable to do this work himself. There was dignity in their words, but also hardship. Musa did not hesitate. Without asking for anything in return, without seeking recognition, he stepped in and helped them. He moved with strength and determination, clearing the way and watering their animals, with an ease that came from both physical ability and a heart that could not stand by while others struggled. When the task was done, he did not linger. He did not seek praise or reward. He turned away and went to the shade, alone once again, and in that quiet moment, he turned to Allah with a sincerity that reveals the depth of his situation. He said that he was in desperate need of whatever good Allah would send down to him. There was no arrogance in this supplication, no sense of entitlement. It was honest, humble, and direct. A man who had once lived in a palace now sat under a tree, asking only for Allah's mercy. What followed was yet another sign of how Allah responds to those who turn to him with sincerity. One of the two women returned to him, and walking with modesty, and conveyed a message from her father. He wished to reward Musa for helping them. Musa accepted the invitation and went with her, entering a home that would become the beginning of a new chapter in his life. There, he met a man of wisdom and righteousness, often identified in Islamic tradition as a prophet, who listened to Musa's story from beginning to end. There was no judgment, no suspicion, only understanding. And then came words that must have brought immense relief to Musa's heart, words that reassured him that he was safe, that he had escaped from the wrongdoing people. But safety was only the beginning. Musa was offered something more than temporary refuge. He was offered stability, purpose, and a place within that family. The man recognized Musa's strength and trustworthiness, the qualities that are not easily found together. It was suggested that Musa could work for him, tending to his flocks, and in return, he would be given the opportunity to marry one of his daughters. This was not a transaction based on wealth or status, but on character and sincerity. Musa accepted, committing himself to years of honest work. Those years in Midian were not just about survival. They were about transformation. The man who had grown up in a palace, who had once been surrounded by power and influence, now lived a life of simplicity and discipline. He learned patience in a new way, not through sudden trials, but through daily responsibility. He learned humility, not as an idea, but as a lived experience. He walked long distances, cared for animals, and lived in a rhythm that connected him to the natural world and to his own inner state. These were not random experiences. This was preparation. Allah was shaping him, refining him, building within him the strength, wisdom, and resilience that would be needed for what was to come. After fulfilling his commitment, Musa set out once again, this time not alone, but with his family. The journey ahead would take him back toward the land he had once fled, but he was not the same man who had left. He carried within him the lessons of Midian, the weight of experience, and a heart that had grown closer to Allah through both hardship and ease. As they traveled, night fell, and the path became difficult to navigate. The cold of the desert intensified, and the darkness made it hard to find direction. It was in this moment, and when uncertainty once again surrounded him, that something extraordinary appeared. In the distance, Musa saw a fire on the side of Mount Tur. It was not just a source of warmth or guidance, it was something that drew him in with a sense of purpose. He told his family to stay where they were, expressing hope that he might bring back news or at least a burning branch to provide light and warmth. As he approached the fire, something happened that would change everything. This was not an ordinary fire. This was a moment chosen by Allah, a moment that would mark the beginning of his prophethood. From that place, Musa heard a voice. It was not like any voice he had ever heard. It was the voice of Allah, calling him, addressing him directly. The ground he stood on was declared sacred, and he was commanded to remove his sandals. And this was not just a physical act. It was a moment of recognition, of awareness that he was in the presence of something far beyond the ordinary. Allah introduced himself, affirming his oneness, establishing the truth that stands above all claims of false divinity. In that moment, the mission of Musa began to unfold. He was chosen, selected for a task that would challenge one of the most powerful tyrants in history. He was commanded to go to Firawn, to confront him, to call him to the worship of Allah alone, and to demand the freedom of those who were oppressed. This was not a small task. This was a direct confrontation with the very system Musa had once been part of, the very ruler who had unknowingly raised him. The weight of this command was immense, and Musa felt it deeply. He did not respond with arrogance or overconfidence. Instead, as he spoke with honesty about his own limitations, he asked Allah to expand his chest, to give him ease in this mission, to untie the knot in his tongue so that his speech would be clear and understood. He knew that communication would be essential, that clarity would matter in the face of deception and denial. He also asked for support, requesting that his brother Harun be made a partner in this mission. This was not a sign of weakness, it was a recognition of the strength that comes from support and cooperation. And Allah, in His mercy, granted these requests. In that moment, everything changed. The shepherd of Midian became the messenger of Allah. The man who had once fled from Firawn was now being sent back to him, not in fear, but with truth. The quiet years of preparation were over, and the real test was about to begin. What lay ahead was not just a confrontation between two individuals, but a clash between truth and falsehood, between humility and arrogance, between divine guidance and human tyranny. And at the center of it all stood Musa, carrying a message that no power on earth could silence. When Musa returned to Egypt, he was no longer the man who had fled in fear. He returned with purpose, carrying a message that did not come from his own thoughts or ambitions, but from Allah Himself. The land that once held memories of danger now became the stage for one of the greatest confrontations in history. Alongside him was his brother Harun, whose presence was a mercy and support, just as Musa had asked. Together, they entered the domain of Fir awn, a place filled with grandeur, guarded by power, and built upon arrogance. And the palace was a symbol of control, where every word spoken was meant to reinforce the illusion that Firawn was beyond challenge. Yet Musa walked into that space with a calm that did not come from worldly strength. It came from certainty. When he stood before Firawn, there was no hesitation in his voice, no trace of fear in his message. He called Firawn to something simple yet profound, something that struck at the very core of his false claim. He told him to worship Allah alone, to abandon his arrogance, and to release the children of Israel from oppression. This was not a negotiation. This was truth being presented clearly, without compromise. Firawn listened, but not with the intention of accepting. His response was layered with denial, mockery, and manipulation. He reminded Musa of his past, and of how he had been raised in the palace, as if that upbringing created a debt that Musa could never escape. He brought up the incident of the man who had been killed, attempting to discredit Musa and shift the focus away from the message. This is how tyrants operate. When they cannot challenge the truth itself, they attack the person delivering it. But Musa did not fall into that trap. He acknowledged what had happened in his past without letting it define the present. He did not deny his mistake, but he made it clear that it was done in a moment before he had received guidance, and that Allah had forgiven him. Then he redirected the conversation to where it belonged, back to the truth that Firawn was trying to avoid. He spoke about the Lord of the worlds, the one who created everything, the one who controls life and death. And his words were not just statements, they were reminders, cutting through the illusion that Firawn had built around himself. Fir awn, however, was not interested in reflection. His heart was hardened, his pride too deeply rooted. He questioned Musa in a way that was meant to confuse the audience around them, asking about the nature of this Lord as if truth could be reduced to something trivial. Musa responded with clarity and confidence, describing Allah as the Lord of the heavens and the earth and everything between them, if only they would believe with certainty. The conversation was not just between two individuals, it was being witnessed by others, and Fir awn knew that maintaining control over their perception was just as important as responding to Musa. So he shifted his approach. When he could not undermine Musa through argument, he turned to accusation. He claimed that Musa was nothing more than a magician, that his message was a form of deception. This was a calculated move. Magic in that society was both feared and respected, and by labeling Musa in this way, Fir awn attempted to frame the situation on his own terms. He wanted the people to see this as a contest of skill, not a call to truth. Musa, however, did not rely on words alone. Allah had given him signs, clear and undeniable, to support his message. In that moment, Musa presented the first of these signs. He threw down his staff, and before the eyes of those present, it transformed into a serpent, real and alive, moving in a way that could not be explained by illusion. The atmosphere shifted instantly. What they were witnessing was not something familiar, not something that could be easily dismissed. Then Musa drew out his hand, and it shone with a radiant light, bright and pure, without any harm. These were not tricks. These were signs, manifestations of a power that was beyond human ability. For a moment, the truth was undeniable, visible in a way that challenged everything Fir awn claimed to be. But arrogance has a way of blinding even the clearest vision. Fir awn refused to accept what was in front of him. Instead of reflecting, instead of questioning his own position, he doubled down on his denial. He declared that this was magic, a threat to the stability of his kingdom. He accused Musa of trying to drive the people out of their land, turning the situation into something political, something that would provoke fear and loyalty among his followers. This was not about truth for Fir awn. It was about control. And so he made a decision that would escalate the confrontation to a public spectacle. He ordered that the most skilled magicians from across the land be gathered. These were individuals who had mastered their craft, who understood the limits and techniques of illusion better than anyone else. Fir awn wanted to create a moment where Musa could be publicly defeated, where the people could see what they believed to be magic, overcome by greater magic. The call went out, and the magicians came, drawn by the promise of reward and status. They were told that if they succeeded, they would be brought close to Fir awn, elevated in position and honored among the elite. This was not just a contest for them, it was an opportunity to rise in a system that valued power and proximity to authority. They prepared themselves, confident in their abilities, and unaware that they were about to witness something that would change their understanding of reality itself. A day was chosen, a time when the people would gather, when the spectacle could be seen by as many as possible. The intention was clear. Fir awn wanted to turn this into a demonstration of his strength, a reinforcement of his narrative. The crowd gathered, anticipation building as the stage was set for a confrontation that would go far beyond what anyone expected. Musa stood there, not surrounded by an army, not backed by wealth or influence, but supported by something far greater. The magicians approached with confidence, even asking Fir awn directly if they would receive a reward if they were victorious. He assured them that they would not only be rewarded but brought close to him, strengthening their motivation. Then the moment came. The magicians began, casting their ropes and staffs, using their skills to create an illusion that filled the eyes of the people with amazement. It appeared as though the ground was alive with moving snakes, a display that showcased the peak of what they could do. The crowd reacted, caught in the spectacle, unsure of what would come next. Musa remained steady. There was no rush, no panic. He waited for the right moment, trusting completely in the command that had been given to him. And when he cast his staff, it did not create an illusion. It became something real, something that moved with purpose, swallowing everything the magicians had thrown. In an instant, the difference between truth and illusion became clear. This was not a competition. This was a revelation. The magicians, who understood their craft better than anyone, recognized immediately that what they were witnessing was not magic. It was something beyond their knowledge, beyond their ability. And in that moment, something remarkable happened. The very people who had been brought to oppose Musa became the first to believe in him. The moment Musa's staff swallowed everything the magicians had thrown was not just a display of power. It was a moment of truth that pierced through illusion with absolute clarity. The crowd that had gathered was expecting entertainment, a contest of skill, something familiar and predictable. But what they witnessed instead shook the very foundation of what they believed. The magicians, the very experts who had mastered deception, understood immediately that this was not part of their world. They knew every trick and every method, every possibility within their craft, and this was none of them. This was real. This was undeniable. Without hesitation, without fear of consequence in that instant, they fell down in prostration. It was not planned. It was not discussed. It was a spontaneous surrender to the truth. They declared with conviction that they believed in the Lord of Musa and Harun. That moment was powerful beyond words. These were not ordinary people. These were individuals who had come with confidence, expecting victory and reward, and in a single instant, their entire perspective changed. They recognized truth when they saw it, and they did not hesitate to align themselves with it, even though they stood in the court of a tyrant who tolerated no opposition. This is the difference between knowledge that is used for arrogance and knowledge that leads to humility. The magicians knew their limits, and when they saw something beyond those limits, they submitted to it. But for Firawn, this moment was not one of reflection. It was one of rage. His authority had been challenged publicly, his narrative shattered in front of his own people, and those he had relied on to defend him had turned against him. His reaction was immediate and filled with fury. He accused the magicians of betrayal, claiming that they had secretly conspired with Musa before the event. This accusation was not based on evidence, but on desperation. When a tyrant begins to lose control, he looks for ways to rewrite the situation, to create doubt, to hold on to power by any means necessary. Firawn's anger quickly turned into threats. He declared that their punishment would be severe, that he would cut off their hands and feet on opposite sides and crucify them on palm trees. These were not empty words. This was the kind of punishment that was meant to instill fear, to serve as a warning to anyone who might think of following the same path. The crowd watched, waiting to see how the magicians would respond. This was the moment where fear usually takes over, where people retreat, where survival instincts silence conviction. But something had changed within them. The same people who had come seeking reward from Fir awn now stood with a completely different mindset. They responded with a calmness that can only come from true belief. They said that no harm Fir awn could inflict would outweigh the truth they had found. And they accepted the reality of what might happen to them, but they also understood that this life is temporary and that returning to Allah was inevitable. They expressed hope that their Lord would forgive them for their past and reward them for their faith. There is something deeply powerful in this moment. These were people who, just hours before, were aligned with Fir awn, seeking his favor, living within his system. Yet when truth became clear, they chose it without hesitation, even at the cost of their lives. This is the strength of true Amen. It is not shaken by threats, not weakened by fear, because it is rooted in certainty. Fir awn, however, did not soften. His arrogance had reached a point where even witnessing such conviction did not move him. Instead, it pushed him further into dhulm. The public defeat did not humble him, and it provoked him. He became more determined than ever to suppress the message of Musa and maintain his control. He could not allow this shift in belief to spread, because if it did, it would threaten everything he had built. And so, the oppression intensified. The children of Israel, who were already suffering, found themselves under even greater pressure. Fir awn increased their burden, making their lives more difficult, hoping that by tightening his grip, he could prevent any form of resistance. He believed that by making their lives unbearable, he could break their spirit completely. But what he did not understand is that oppression often has the opposite effect. It does not always break people. Sometimes it strengthens their reliance on Allah. During this period, Allah sent a series of clear signs to Pharaoh and his people, through each one a warning, each one an opportunity to reflect and change. These were not subtle signs. They were overwhelming, impossible to ignore. The land was struck with floods that disrupted life and destroyed what they had built. Swarms of locusts consumed their crops, leaving them in a state of loss and desperation. Lice spread among them, causing discomfort and distress. Frogs appeared in large numbers, invading their homes and their spaces, turning daily life into chaos. And then came the water turning into blood, a sign that affected one of their most essential resources. Each of these signs was specific, impactful, and undeniable. And with each one, the pattern repeated. When the punishment came, they would turn to Musa, asking him to pray to his Lord to remove it, promising that they would believe and let the children of Israel go. And in those moments, fear would break through their arrogance, and they would recognize their need for relief. Musa would pray, and by the will of Allah, the punishment would be lifted. But as soon as relief came, they would return to their old ways. Their promises meant nothing. Their words were empty. This cycle repeated again and again, showing a deep stubbornness, a refusal to accept truth even when it was presented in the clearest way possible. It was not a lack of evidence that held them back. It was arrogance, pride, and a desire to maintain control. Firawn stood at the center of all this, watching these signs unfold, experiencing their impact, yet refusing to change. His heart had become so hardened that even witnessing repeated miracles did not move him toward belief. Instead, he continued to present himself as the ultimate authority, maintaining the illusion of control, even as everything around him pointed to the opposite. At the same time, Musa continued his mission with patience and determination. He did not respond to dhulm with dhulm. He did not lose focus or become overwhelmed. He continued to call Firawn and his people to the truth, to remind them of Allah, to warn them of the consequences of their actions. His strength was not in force, but in consistency. He remained firm regardless of how many times they rejected him. This phase of the story reveals something essential about human nature. Signs alone are not enough if the heart is closed. Evidence alone cannot guide someone who refuses to see. Firawn and his people were not lacking in proof. They were lacking in humility. And without humility, even the clearest truth can be denied. As the dhulm continued and the signs were repeatedly ignored, it became clear that the situation was moving toward a decisive moment. The time for warnings was nearing its end, and what lay ahead would be a conclusion that no one could escape. The arrogance of Firawn had reached its peak, and when arrogance reaches that level, the fall that follows is not just inevitable, it is absolute. There comes a point when dhulm is no longer met with warnings, when repeated signs are no longer followed by chances, and when the balance shifts from patience to decisive action. That moment had arrived. After years of oppression, after countless signs that were denied again and again, Allah commanded Musa with something that would change everything. He was told to take Bani Isra'il and leave under the cover of night. As this was not a gradual migration or a negotiated release, this was an escape, quiet and urgent, away from a land that had suffocated them for generations. Families gathered what little they had, hearts filled with a mixture of hope and fear. They had lived their entire lives under Firawn's control, and now they were stepping into the unknown, guided only by the promise of Allah. The night carried a strange stillness as they moved. There was no celebration, no loud expressions of freedom, only cautious steps and whispered prayers. They knew that if Fir awn discovered their departure, he would not let them go without a fight, and it did not take long. By the time morning came and their absence was noticed, Fir awn's anger erupted like never before. This was not just about losing a group of people. This was about losing control, about being defied, about the collapse of the image he had built for himself. He gathered his forces, calling upon his army with urgency and fury, determined to chase them down and bring them back under his authority, or destroy them completely. The Alad shook with the movement of soldiers, horses and chariots as Fir awn set out in pursuit. Dust rose into the air, marking their path, a visible sign of the power that had once seemed unstoppable. Meanwhile, Musa and Bani Isra'il continued forward until they reached a place that seemed to offer no escape. Before them was the sea, vast and unyielding, stretching beyond sight. Behind them, the army of Firawn was closing in, their presence growing louder, closer, more threatening with every passing moment. Panic spread among the people. This was the moment where fear reached its peak, and they looked at Musa, their voices filled with desperation, saying that they were surely going to be overtaken. It was a human reaction, a natural response to what seemed like an impossible situation. But Musa did not speak from fear. He did not let the panic around him shape his words. Instead, he spoke with a certainty that could only come from complete trust in Allah. He said that his Lord was with him and that he would guide him. This was not blind optimism. This was conviction rooted in everything he had experienced, everything he had witnessed, and everything he knew about the power of Allah. In that moment, when there seemed to be no way forward and no chance of survival, revelation came. Allah commanded Musa to strike the sea with his staff. What happened next was beyond anything they could have imagined. The sea did not resist, and it responded. It split, opening into paths that stretched across its depths, with walls of water rising on either side. The ground beneath became firm and dry, creating a passage where there had been none. It was a moment that redefined what was possible, a direct manifestation of Allah's power, showing that when He wills something, the laws of nature themselves submit. Bani Isra'il began to move, step by step, into the path that had been opened for them. Fear turned into urgency, urgency into movement, and movement into hope. They crossed between towering walls of water, a sight that must have been both awe-inspiring and overwhelming. Every step was a reminder that they were being protected, that what they were witnessing was not just a miracle, but a rescue. Behind them, Fir awn and his army arrived at the edge of the sea, and what they saw was the same as what Bani Isra'il had seen, but their reaction was completely different. Where there should have been reflection, there was arrogance. Where there should have been caution, there was blind pursuit. Fir awn, who had denied every sign, who had rejected every warning, saw this opening not as a miracle to humble him, but as an opportunity to continue his chase. His arrogance had reached a point where even this did not make him pause. He believed that he could follow them, that he could pass through the same path and maintain his control. And so, he entered. His army followed, chariots rolling into the parted sea, soldiers moving forward with the same confidence they had always carried. For a moment, it must have seemed as though nothing could stop them. The path was there, the ground was firm, and their target was within reach. But what they did not understand was that this path was not created for them. It was a mercy for those who believed and a trap for those who denied. As the last of Bani Isra'il crossed safely to the other side, the command came. The sea, which had stood like walls, returned to its original state. the water collapsed with overwhelming force, crashing down upon Firawn and his army. In an instant, the power that had once dominated the land was swallowed by the very creation it had tried to defy. The chariots disappeared, the soldiers were overcome, and Fir awn himself was caught in the mouge of destruction. It was in that moment, when there was no escape, when the reality of death became undeniable, that Fir awn finally spoke words he had refused to say his entire life. As he declared that he believed in the Lord of Bani Isra'il, that he submitted to the truth he had rejected for so long. But this was not faith born from sincerity. This was a reaction to certainty of death. This was belief that came when the unseen had become seen, when the test was no longer a test, and Allah made it clear that such belief would not be accepted. A lifetime of arrogance cannot be erased by a final moment of fear. A heart that rejected truth again and again cannot suddenly claim sincerity when there is no longer a choice. Firawn's end was not just a punishment. It was a lesson, a warning, a sign that would remain long after him. Allah tells us that his body would be preserved so that those who come after could see, could reflect, could understand. The one who claimed to be the highest Lord, and who built his identity on power and control, was reduced to a lifeless body, carried by the same water he could not command. His Nahayat was not hidden. It was exposed, made visible as a reminder that no matter how high someone rises in arrogance, they remain under the authority of Allah. And as Bani Isra'il stood on the other side, safe and free, the contrast could not have been clearer. On one side, a people who had been oppressed, now witnessing their rescue. On the other, a tyrant who had seemed unstoppable, now gone, his power erased in a single moment. This is the reality that repeats itself throughout history. Dhulm may last for a time. Arrogance may appear strong, but when it stands against the will of Allah, its end is already written. The story does not just end with the drowning of Firawn. It continues as a message for every generation. It reminds us that power is not a measure of truth, that control is not a sign of righteousness, and that no matter how dominant falsehood may appear, it cannot survive when it is confronted by what is real. Firawn's Nihaya was terrifying, not just because of how he died, but because of what it represented. A life built on arrogance, ending in regret. A man who claimed divinity, reduced to a sign for others. And for those who listen carefully, there is a question that remains. Not about Firawn, but about ourselves. When truth becomes clear, do we recognize it like the magicians did, or do we deny it like Firawn? Because in the end, the difference between the two is not knowledge. It is the state of the heart.